Today, we're gonna go behind the scenes and check out an editing breakdown on this hype trailer I edited before the Daytona 24-hour race.
Winning at this Coliseum takes heart. The heart of a gladiator. The heart of a car. The heart of a team. The heart of racing.
All right, we're gonna break this edit down into three main pillars. The first is editing, then we'll move on to color, and lastly, we'll finish with sound. Now, as we get into the visuals and the editing part of the process, I'll explain a little bit about how I got these shots. You can only edit sort of the shots that you've got, and so naturally the shooting part of this process is also very important. So some of the editing breakdown will be also how I was thinking of it when I was shooting it, knowing that that's how I wanted to use it in the edit. Now let's have a look at this timeline. All right, some quick housekeeping before we jump into the first pillar. Let's go over some of the colors that you see. So everything that you see that's in teal is representative of one of the clips that I shot. On the editing side, you'll see a few of these pink layers. Those are solid mattes. And then you've got some of these blue layers, which represent different effects that I used. Moving into the audio, the lime green section is the voiceover. Everything you see in brown represents broadcast audio. Orange is often representative of music, but in this case, it was just sort of a backtrack. And then pink represents all of the sound effects I used, but we'll get more into that later. Now let's jump into pillar one, editing. Now my typical editing style is very fast, right? I like to sort of represent the speed of these cars inside of my edits. For this one, because I was trying to build a little bit of drama, I have a series of slow sections, and then that leads us into much faster sections. And so the point was to put a lot of emphasis in the voiceover piece and also keep the sort of audience guessing. I'm gonna break this edit down into sections based on the VO work that was done, the first of which being this Coliseum bit.
Winning at this Coliseum takes heart.
So the whole point of this was to establish a bit of a trend. I was going to use heart quite a lot because the team that I was working with here was the heart of racing, and I knew I wanted the narrative to finish on the heart of racing. So we established very early this sort of idea that it takes heart to win at this Coliseum. Now these first two shots that you see are quite nice. It was a sunset. I was shooting these while I was on the track walk on Wednesday, I think, before the Roar. I shot them with my A7S III. I had a Sigma 16 to 28mm lens, and I was using my DJI Ronin 2 gimbal. So just a nice time of day to grab some like really nice shots. We transitioned into a night shot, and the reason I wanted to go with a night shot here instead of the sunset shots was because I knew that I wanted to go into this next section, which was sort of simulating nighttime driving with Roman in the car. And so I didn't want that transition to be overly harsh by adding another sunset shot here, which is what I originally had. So as we transition from the day, we go into night, and then we flash into this nighttime driving, and it just makes that a little bit less stark. Now, before I get into these shots with Roman, I'll just say that I do a lot of this flashing on screen. If you're familiar with my work, you know that I do a lot of these like really bright flashes, almost like camera flashes. Recently, I've been doing this bit of a difference effect, which is basically, you know, I've got a solid white matte here, just a solid color. In this case, this solid matte is 2 frames, one over each of the clips that it's transitioning between. I have set the blend mode to difference. Typically when I'm doing that, if you don't have a black and white clip underneath that solid matte, it tends to look kind of funny. So I tend to cut the clips and make them black and white underneath that solid flash. But before I do that, so that it's not so abrupt, I do transition it with a non-additive dissolve. This is just a basic effect in most editors. So you'll see if I go frame by frame here, it transitions very slowly to the black and white version, which then lays underneath that white matte so that it looks like really clean. Now, these shots with Roman were extremely important to sort of build the intensity of this piece. We sort of set the tone straight out of the gate here with this fast movement. These were pretty simple to get. I basically put a black backdrop over the car. I had the Sigma 28 to 105 on my FX3. In hindsight, I would have preferred a little bit wider lens, but I didn't have it with me at the time. I had 2 tube lights that were strobing at roughly 400 and 250 milliseconds, and basically just shook the camera around to simulate some night driving. Definitely made it feel very intense, like he was driving. I just had him like move his hands like he was running. So we have a combination of a few pieces, and I'm using that same non-additive dissolve to transition a little bit less harsh in between them. So I'm just gonna go frame by frame and walk through this a little bit. So we've got a little bit more zoomed out that shows his hand here. You can see that non-additive dissolve start sort of working here. It transitions to a much more punched in version right on his helmet. We do a non-additive dissolve again. You can kind of see parts of the next frame are coming in. We have one right on his gloves, slamming a gear on the gear shifter. And then at that same time, we have some of the green flashing lights that were on the dash come in to sort of simulate that it was bumping up against the rev limiter was the point, and that's how I assisted it with the audio. And the last part of this section was a clip that I got of the car on track. Now, this clip was shot on a tripod, and I'm actually sort of being unsteady with the camera here on purpose. I knew that this is how I wanted to use the shot. Of course, I could very easily do a nice smooth pan, but I wanted this to feel somewhat intense, like the car was almost so fast that it was struggling to stay in the frame, like I was struggling to track it. It was so fast. So I get a little bit ahead of the car, and then the car sort of zooms by as I'm stopping it. I wish I would have like kept panning back to the right. I end up stopping the camera, so it's kind of, this last frame is kind of dead. Perhaps in hindsight I would have done that a little bit better, but this whole first sequence is supposed to initiate and punch really hard. That adds a lot of drama and intensity when you cycle quickly between slow bits and fast bits. Real quick, we're gonna pause this video. I have two things that I wanna say. First, if you like this video, please hit that like button. It definitely helps the channel. It is the biggest driver, the biggest analytical driver for growth on this channel. And it also tells me that this is the kind of stuff that you wanna see. And second, because this is my first breakdown, if there's something I'm missing here, please feel free to ask in the comments and I will answer it. This is the first one, so there's gonna be growing pains. It's not gonna hurt my feelings. I definitely want this to be helpful to you. And so if you have a question, please ask it. Okay, moving on to section 2, we have another voiceover piece.
The heart of a gladiator.
So playing with that intro bit where I talk about to win at this Coliseum, I wanted to keep that same theme when it came to the drivers, and instead of calling them drivers, I decided to go with a piece that called them gladiators. But in this section, I wanted to highlight the drivers. Now, this is a great example of why you need to have good shots, because from an editing perspective, there's nothing overly special about the editing. These are just clips that are sort of pieced together, but they're extremely attractive looking shots because of the lighting setup. Now, if you watch part 1 of my Road to Rolex series, you know that I had an entire media day where I set up lights and I set up backdrops, and I had the guys in for a little bit of time where I could make different lighting adjustments and capture a variety of shots that I intend to use throughout the year, but also very dramatic shots that I was able to use in this edit. You'll notice a theme of planning sort of out throughout this entire process. I'm not a guy that storyboards necessarily because I'm a solo creator, so as long as it's in my head, I have a general idea of what I need, but I know that I wanted this piece to be relatively dramatic, so I gave myself a lot of dramatic options with this lighting. This one of Alex is just with a single tube light set sort of above him and just a little behind. Another one of Alex where I had another light behind him, and I also had a bit of more of a key light. And then the last one of Tom, same deal, one light over him and a little bit back, but I was also using a Prime FX lens filter in front of the lens, and that's what gives it this little refraction effect. Super simple clips. I transition it again with another one of those difference flashes. This time I decided not to go black and white underneath. I kind of liked, because this is pretty monochromatic on the screen, it doesn't look nearly as bad when you put that white matte over top, and it just like, it made everything somewhat red. So basically it's just an inverting effect. This one is 3 frames. I decided that 2 frames just felt a little quick, but then I get into a little bit more of the driving. For this fast-paced section, I knew I wanted to have sort of a lot of sounds of the cars, but I wanted to still focus on the drivers. I got this great shot of Zach driving the car from a sort of steering wheel POV during our car-to-car session, which is basically to say when we're doing like chase laps for photographer media, I was able to clamp an action camera onto the steering shaft of the car, and we got some really wicked flares inside the passenger side window. And so this is sped up quite a lot because on those laps we go quite slow. The next clip was another clip of Roman. I sort of don't like to reuse this, but the clips were quite epic, and it's like one of the few instances I have where like the intensity level is just at 10 with these shots. And in these fast-paced sections, I really wanted it to feel super punchy. So as I frame through, it's just another shot of Roman sort of using his arm as foreground right on his helmet. Then there's another gear shifter clip. Obviously an astute eye can tell that my lights are in frame here. I struggled with that a little bit of what do I add it or not add it, but ultimately the cuts are so fast, I don't think anybody would actually be able to put together that those are just like stage lights inside the car. Now, something to note about this clip is I really liked the action, so I'm like zooming in on his finger. So I really liked the action, but the problem was I wasn't shaking it at that point. I don't know why. I was pretty steady. So like here's what the clip looks like, just straight out the box. So very smooth. So I decided to add some camera shake because these other clips have quite a bit of intensity, and this one just was a bit jarring because I wasn't doing the shaking effect. So I decided to put an adjustment layer up, add some camera shake to that, and sort of make it match the clip that was before it. You're welcome to copy these settings. I come back to these quite often. Lastly, we have a cool helmet shot, another one from the studio setup where we just have Roman looking up. This is with another Prism FX lens filter. Now, before we move on to the next section, I do want to say that you'll find that I end up moving the frame around a lot. And what that means is in a lot of these clips, I'm doing a very subtle punch in or punch out just to create a little bit of movement in some otherwise static shots. So just using this shot of Alex as an example, if you look at these keyframes, I'm 0.5, which is just every pixel in frame. And then throughout the course of the clip, I'm punching in extremely slowly, and I end up on 0.54. So basically I just wanted to create a little bit of movement. I'm not necessarily trying to fake gimbal movement or anything like that, but the shots just don't look quite as good to me when they're just completely static. I wanted to add a little bit of motion, and in most of these clips, I'm doing that. So same thing on the second one. It's just a very small punch in to create a little bit more movement in an otherwise very still frame. So I do it quite a lot. Even on these shots with Zach, you'll see I'm 0.5 again, and I zoom in quite quickly, quite a bit more in these fast sections because I'm trying to add that intensity. We do it with the shot of Roman, and ultimately it's something I do for almost every clip. It's very rare for me at this point not to have some sort of movement created by keyframing. Moving on to the next section, you'll see that the timeline starts to go up a little bit, and really all that is that I had different options I was working through. So before I ended with the drone shot, I was working on bits of the car because this part of the VO talks about the car specifically.
The heart of a car.
So the slow section is emphasizing the car. I had these couple shots from a couple of the media shoots that we did. Ultimately, I felt like they were a little boring, and thankfully IMSA provided us with this lovely drone clip of the entire field when they were doing the field photo on Wednesday before the race. We do another flash. Moving into the facts section, we have an assortment of sort of really interesting shots. So first we have a sort of faked rig shot. We're not allowed to have any sort of camera rigging on the outside of the car during sessions. So this is actually a shot that I was able to get while the car was being tugged out for photos. So you can't see because the car is turning left, but it's actually being tugged out onto the racetrack to take photos. It has that same camera shake effect because, again, the car was moving out very slowly, so I wanted to speed it up but also add a lot of intensity. So I added that camera shake effect. That moves into this lovely sort of sunrise shot we got when we were doing the car-to-car sessions this year. I added a little bit of camera shake here. We're only doing about 30 miles an hour for these shots, and it was just a little bit too smooth based on the intensity I wanted from the onboard shots, which I definitely wanted to be shaky. Just for reference, I'll show these clips really quickly without the camera shake. Just a little too, especially this first one, just way too clean. So with the camera shake, you get a little bit more intensity. It's extremely subtle. Thankfully, this particular plugin has a motion blur setting as well, so it doesn't just feel like super jittery. We then move into a similar shot as the first one where this car is being pushed out at Sebring to have some photos taken. Transition me out of the onboard shots. I do another one of the flash transitions, and then I couple that with a shot of the Valkyrie flying by relatively quickly. Now again, I like the juxtaposition of sort of speed going right into slow. So I chose this particular shot because there's a massive amount of movement in the frame instead of ending on one of these shots because they're really interesting shots, but they're not that fast in terms of movement. So that's why we go with one of the trackside shots. So moving on to one of the last sections, I'm just gonna play it through.
The heart of a team.
Boy, that Aston sounds marvelous from up close.
The heart.
For this one, I knew I wanted to highlight some of maybe the crew guys in some of this, and then also the drivers more as a team instead of just the individual shots that we did before. These shots were got during a media day session where we did a shot of the cars sitting by themselves, but then also the drivers, and then lastly the team together. It's very common to do shots like that at the beginning of the year, and we were able to get all of those. We had decent light for it. You'll see in a lot of my gimbal movements, I have the FPV mode on, and I end up rotating the gimbal a little bit as I'm going back. For the same purpose that the punch in and out I was discussing earlier, I just want to add a little bit of extra movement to the shots. They're a little bit boring if I was just doing a sort of side-by-side pan. So this adds a little bit of something extra. I was quite happy with these two shots. A lot of times I'm a little lost when I'm shooting the team stuff. It's a little bit boring. This is a little bit different where I'm using the car as foreground, coming up over the hood, and then same deal here, coming back from the car and showing the guys. So they were really patient with me, and I think the shots turned out really nice. So then I'm transitioning into what will be the last fast section of the sequence. Now we're doing section of the pit crew guys. I have an assortment of rigging shots that I've used throughout the last year or so. This is a clip of an action cam bolted onto one of the impact wrenches that they use inside their garage area. And then right as it makes impact with the car, we go to a Valkyrie shot where the same thing is basically happening, but now from a different angle. The reason that I use these two together is I know that I'm gonna make one of the wheel gun sound effects at the end of this, and I didn't want to just lose what it was doing. So now you'll see in this shot, I'm doing the same thing. If I was just holding the camera there, it would be relatively boring, right? Because there's not a lot of movement in the frame. So you'll see that I'm like, as I know that he's getting ready to hit the gun, I end up panning the camera to the left, right in front of the light. So you get some of this cool like little flaring event from the light, but ultimately it's a very static action, right? He's not moving at all, but I'm moving the camera, right? If my subject is moving, I'm not really moving my camera, I'm just moving with the subject. If my subject is not moving, you'll see that I'm always moving the camera. We move into a rigging shot of a snap-on wrench, basically same thing. I've got a clamp on the end of a snap-on. I've got the action cam pointed straight down. We move into a nice shot. Again, I'm not really moving that much because my subject's moving, so a nice little pan here of Jordan taking both wheels. Another rigging shot of the action camera on the actual wheel gun that they're using on the pit lane. And then I go into two final shots of the drivers. The idea here was to have a shot of them like looking towards the race. I know it sounds like somewhat artsy, but the idea in all of this is it's a hype edit pre-race, so we're looking ahead to the race. So I wanted to end on that, and then we reveal the full team shot on the heart, finally the heart of racing. So here's how it plays out at the end.
Boy, that Aston sounds marvelous.
The heart of racing.
But that is the gist of the edit. Nothing overly complicated, not a massive amount of effects, all relatively simple. Now that takes care of the edit. We're gonna move on to pillar 2 now, where we look at color. Okay, now when it comes to color, I have well-documented stuff online about my color grading process. Now, I'll preface by saying that everything I always shoot is always in S-Log3. But with that said, my idea for color grading is relatively simple. So first I'll convert the footage, I'll color correct, and then I'll move on to actually color grading. So just to give an idea on color, it would be silly to go through every clip. I'm gonna go through a couple of them, the different ones, and show a bit of the process. But one of the biggest mistakes I see from relatively new people with color grading is that they tend to leave everything on the high side, so they don't worry about much on their black point. You'll see a consistent theme with my stuff that I tend to crush the blacks and bring the exposure down as much as possible. It makes the colors a lot punchier as well. The higher you go on the exposure spectrum, the more washed out everything looks. And the lower you drop everything, the more punchy and the more saturated it looks. Studio shots were pretty simple to grade as well. If I just turn everything off, this is the S-Log3 image straight out of camera. This is with it converted, even just converted, because we have all the lighting controlled and everything so easy. This is already like a pretty killer image. We turn the correction nodes on, you see that I just get a little bit more highlight push. We'll turn the color grading on. There's not a lot there. It's maybe moving the blues a little bit more aqua. And then lastly, the sharpening, a fairly simple process there. To do an example on the second clip, this is a completely S-Log3 image. This is it converted into Rec 709. This is with the color correction. And then lastly, this is the color grading. Last clip I'm going to show you in terms of color grading, just to give a little bit better example as to the process. I'm going to turn everything off here. This is the S-Log3 image. This is it converted. These cameras are extremely powerful, right? They give you tons of options. It's 10-bit color. It's good dynamic range, but it's up to you to bring out the most in that image. So this is converted straight into Rec 709. We make our exposure adjustments, which for me, just to sort of emphasize what that means, in the exposure node, I'm just changing very basic stuff, highlights, pumping contrast in, bringing exposure down. Same thing on the temperature, very small adjustments to compensate for whatever my lighting situation is. But ultimately the image is still looking fairly boring. And then we'll turn on my color. That's when it starts to look a little bit more like everything else that I'm doing. I'm a big fan of turning the blues a little bit more towards the green and then turning the actual greens a little bit more towards yellow. what I find is that that makes the image feel relatively warm without having to pump a bunch of just straight warm tint into it with the temp slider. So I could obviously do that with the temp slider, but what happens when you do that is it does shove these colors that direction, but it also makes your whites a little bit warm. So moving just the colors around is a way to make the image feel more warm without actually wrecking the whites and blacks of your image. And lastly, something I'll mention is obviously in the foreground here, we have a bit of the track, somewhat boring. It's also a little bit eye-catching because it's quite bright compared to some of the image. So it's very often that I will add a bit of a mask. I'll just add a little gradient mask in my power window, drag that up, and this is a before and after of what I get out of that. And that basically is just to help put the attention back onto the center point of my frame. And color is one of those things that you just have to work at. I've got tons of tutorials online on my page about my entire process and specifically what this node tree means. But if you want the easy route, you can download my exact power grade and my LUT as well. There's a link down below for those. And now we're gonna move on to pillar number 3, sound. I wanna start by saying that I would say of all of the components and all the pillars that we've talked about, sound is where I am maybe the worst. It's something that I'm trying to get good at. Take my advice with a grain of salt. All right, first we're gonna listen to everything without the actual sound effects layers and just the clip audio, the music, and the voiceover work. Now you'll see these brown sections represent some broadcast audio. Those are important because I think they help drive the feeling that you're sort of at the racetrack. To give an example, that here's the broadcast audio to start us off.
The famous Daytona Beach Land Speed Records racing.
So 2 things to note here. Anytime I'm doing broadcast stuff, I will add an echo effect onto it. And it's basically to help make it feel like it's like you're a spectator at the track because there's quite a bit of reverb when you're at the track between speakers. So the purpose of that is to make it feel a little bit more authentic that you're actually at the racetrack. You can copy my settings that I have on screen here, but ultimately it's pretty stock. Also, I wanted these to lay a little bit lower in the mix. So to say that I didn't want them to be super out in front like some of my other edits, I wanted them to be very much behind everything else. And so to make them sound almost a little bit muffled. And so you'll see if I go on this clip, you'll see in my equalizer, I end up boosting the low end and I end up cutting off the high end. So to give an example of what all this is doing, I'm just gonna go in, I'm gonna turn the echo effect off. This is the piece of audio with nothing, just straight the way they gave it.
The famous Daytona Beach Land Speed Records racing.
This is it with the echo.
The famous Daytona Beach Land Speed Records racing.
And then lastly here is with the EQ work.
The famous Daytona Beach Land Speed Records racing.
And basically I wanted it to sound a little bit trippy. I didn't want it to overpower any of the voiceover work, and I also wanted it to lay a little bit lower in the mix. Now we're gonna give it a playthrough with everything but sound effects.
Winning at this Coliseum takes heart. The heart of a gladiator.
They're racing for the Rolex.
The heart of a car.
Scream of
The heart of a team.
As far as the music is concerned, I chose not to use like an actual track for this. I just wanted this sort of drone. This is from Ocular Sounds, and you can kind of see here, it's just a distorted choir drone. It's just something that could lay underneath it, sound a bit melodic, but I didn't want to have to be editing things to the beats. I wanted to sort of put everything together however I wanted. And so this is what it sounds like with just that. So Ocular Sounds has a lot of these droning sort of notes and effects that I end up using a lot and finding myself using more and more. Getting away from the sort of trending audio stuff, I would like to do more with the actual sound effects, and I think when you're trying to use that sound effects with an actual musical track, everything can get a little bit lost. So this drone is just to sort of pace the piece a little bit, and then it cuts out, of course, as we move into the end. All right, I'm gonna play this through one time with only the sound effects on. So I'm not going to go through every single sound effect, but I do want to give a sort of bit of guidance on the sound effects that I'm using at the moment. So a lot of these punchy sound effects that you hear that sound like this, Those are sound effects from Ocular Designs. And so let me just show you which pack I'm using. I have quite a lot, but these specifically are from one of the packs called Quantum. And so you get a lot of impacts, hits, and whooshes. So just as an example, if I was to open a hits folder, give you another one, you get a lot of very intense sounding hits and impacts. And I feel like I'm using those a little bit more and more right now as I go, especially when I'm going from these like slow edits into a lot of intensity. I'm using a lot of those types of sounds. I'm gonna walk through some of my philosophy on sound effects. Again, this is a piece I struggle with, but this is what I've sort of learned so far. So I do a lot of tonal stuff to set the tone here, a little bit of a impact boom, and then some really low end sort of reverb. And then I'm trying to add sort of points of impact to assist in some of the other sounds that you heard earlier. So I'm just gonna go through a little section of this to give an example. It's all somewhat repetitive, like I said, so I'm not gonna break everything down, but I'm gonna go through the section where we do the pit stop stuff. Obviously, like I said, I like to make an impact at the flash of the edit, so here's what that would sound like. I don't want it to be like a camera flash effect or anything like that. I just want it to be super punchy, and I think that these do a good job of that. But I also want the sound effects to assist in some of the actual audio elements that we have in. So I'll have a various number of sound effects as different scenes start. Obviously, you need practicals just like you would with lighting, where we've got wrench clicks as the socket wrench is being turned. So you hear a multitude of scenes like as different things of action are happening. So you've got one right as the scene starts. You've got one as the wheel gun hits, and then you've got one going to the next scene. So here it is together. These practical sounds that we have of, say, the wheel gun, for example. So let's just turn this on quick. So you've got a sound of the wheel being tightened. A fine sound, but if you can take one of these impacts and combine it with that sound, you'll get something a little bit more punchy. And so a lot of the sound effects that I have in here, if I'm not using them to transition between scenes, are used to aid some of the sounds that you already hear, some of the practical sounds that you hear in the edit. And so to give another example of that, we have this drone clip. And so I wanted to give this sensation that we were sort of like right on the cars and we were whooshing as we went by. So I'm using a couple different sounds for that. I have a bit of a long whoosh that I use, but I'll also couple that with a bit of a Doppler type of whooshing effect. And so when you add those two things together. And so to give a last example of how I'm using these with practical effects, I'm just gonna turn on this car zoom by. Again, I want to give that flyby sensation. The audio of the car, the practical does it quite well, but I also wanted to give it a bit more because it's actually transitioning us to another scene. So to achieve that, I added a bit of a low end whoosh first. Then to help me transition to another scene, I added a riser and then just a little small low end impact. Here's it again. And then here are those things together. All extremely subtle. I am trying to make it noticeable, but not noticeable at the same time. I don't know that I totally pulled that off here. Again, it was the last part of my process. Another rep, another learning experience, and something that I will try to improve on in the future. That's pretty much it. That is how I edited this piece. Not overly complicated, but there was a lot of planning that went into the shots, and that makes the editing part of the process significantly easier. Because this is my first editing breakdown, if there's something that I didn't cover that you would like to see in my next one, or even that I can answer for this one, feel free to leave that in the comments below. If you like this breakdown, please click the like button. I know everyone says to do that, but it really does help the channel. I've looked at all the analytics, and that's probably the biggest driver of growth is the like button. That'll tell me to do more of these in the future. But until then, we will see you in the next one.